Hello, today we're going to read Chapter 7, A Final Solution. In Germany, as soon as the Nazis came to power, Jews were persecuted for no reason except their religion. Jews who weren't even religious were persecuted. Having a Jewish grandparent was enough to get you in trouble. There was an evil disease in the world that had been around for a very long time. It was called anti-Semitism. It was the hatred of Jews. No one was quite sure where it came from, although the subject was studied endlessly. No question about it, Jews had been troublesome to kings and priests. Jews believe that every person is equal before God, which, if you think about it, means that a king is no different from a peasant. Now, now that is a non-conforming idea. It must have been maddening to some authorities. Imagine where it might lead if everyone thought that way. Just where might it lead? To a democracy? Eventually? The Jews are people with a powerful book. It is a freedom document written in Hebrew and called a Bible. It tells stories that make people think and ask questions, and it tells how a long time ago the Jews escaped from Egypt, where they were slaves of the Pharaoh. It tells of Queen Esther and how she saved the Jews when they refused to bow to the king's agent, wicked Haman. That Bible became the starting point for a new religion called Christianity and for another called Islam. At first, Christians were persecuted. Then, in the 4th century CE, the Roman Emperor Constantine became a Christian. Before long, most Europeans were Christians, but not the Jews. The Jews stayed with their beliefs. They wouldn't change their religion even for the emperor or the people. It was frustrating to those in charge. Others might catch their independent ideas. So some of those in power hated them and blamed them for whatever was wrong at the time. If there was a plague, it was the Jews' fault. If there was an economic disaster, it was the Jews' fault. Finally, many of Europe's Christians went on religious wars called Crusades. The Crusaders' aim was to recapture Jerusalem from the Muslims, but anyone not a Christian was considered an infidel, a heretic, and was liable to be murdered. Thousands of Jews died, and Jewish property was up for grabs amongst the Crusaders. In Spain in 1492, Jews were told that they had to leave the country. Jews had already been expelled from many other parts of Europe. They couldn't take their possessions with them. It was a windfall for the rest of the Spaniards. Jews who converted to Christianity were able to stay in Spain, but some were tried by a religious court called an Inquisition. And if they were found guilty of not being sincere Christians, they were burned alive. That was the opposite of what real Christianity stands for, but most people didn't question the rulers and the priests who were in command. So, anti-Semitism stayed in the air. It was still mainly about the non-conformism. Then, in 1517, Martin Luther came into conflict with the Catholic Church, and things got complicated. The Catholics in each of the new Protestant sects seemed to believe that they alone had one true religion, and led to centuries of religious wars. Christians were killing Christians as well as Jews. Hatred and killing in the name of God shouldn't make sense, but it seemed to some people who couldn't have been thinking deeply. There was another factor that produced anti-Semitism. It was economic. Jews were often successful and provided competition that many have made some people jealous and annoyed. Then, toward the end of the 18th century, things began to change. After the French Revolution in 1789, Jews in one nation after another were emancipated. They centered They entered Europe's mainstream. People who had been locked in ghettos were suddenly let out and began a period of great achievement, especially in Germany, Austria, and Hungary. Jews flocked to universities, and soon many of them were doctors, lawyers, store owners, newspaper writers, musicians, teachers, and political leaders. Although Jews made up only 1% of the German population, they won one quarter of all Germany's Nobel Prizes in the first third of the 20th century. Some Germans were proud of that achievement, but others saw it as a problem. There was something else. It had to do with the science. At least some people thought it was a science. It was racism. And today we think of it as a false or a pseudoscience. But in the 19th century, some thinkers who believed in what they were doing divided the world's people into races, and they said that some races were better than others. They even said that race determines blood and character and brain size. They said that Jews were an evil race that was polluting Aryan, white, Northern European blood. They said that people of color were inferior to whites. Since this theory was supposed to be scientific, there were many who believed them. Hitler used that idea of racism and bad blood and the old anti Semitic virus to explain Germany's problems. It was convenient. Whatever was wrong must be the fault of the Jews. Inflation, depression, the Treaty of Versailles, it was all because of the Jews, said Hitler. He was an astonishing speaker. People were swept up by his words. They believed him. It was easier than blaming themselves. Besides, many Jews had good jobs in nice homes. All their property was inviting. Hitler was soon giving it away. Germany went further down the road of wickedness than any nation in history. The Nazis used the technology of the modern world for purposes of murder. They built factories for killing. Then they hunted down the Jews of Europe, packed them in railroad cars, and sent them to be slaughtered. They didn't just kill Jews. Hitler hated Slavs who lived in Eastern Europe, gypsies, people who were crippled, and anyone who didn't agree with him. The Nazis killed as many people as they could. They enslaved others. It made Hitler and his terror troops feel powerful, and it set an example for other dictators in the future. Because of what was happening to the Jews and Hitler's other victims, all of Europe shivered. People knew that after the Jews were gone, it could happen to them. Did all did all this have anything to do with the United States? That is a good question. Suppose you see someone beating up on someone else, really beating her up. She is going to end up in the hospital or maybe dead. What do? This isn't your fight. If you try to break it up, you'll almost certainly will get slugged. Should you call the police? Should you stay out of it? If someone is killed, it won't be your fault, or will it? Are we responsible for others? Do you agree that he who permits evil commits evil? In 1939, 20,000 children, all under the age of 14, were in danger in Germany. Hitler wished to get rid of them. He was willing to let them leave the country. Many were Jewish, some were not. Quakers, Jews, Catholics, and members of other American church groups agreed to take responsibility for them. It would not cost the government any money. Surely America would accept them. This is the land of promise, the land built on a spirit of generosity, the land that, from the days of the Pilgrims, had been a place of refuge for the persecuted of other nations. Those who had founded this nation and written its constitution had been clear about it. Although they were much alike, white, male, Protestant, and of English descent, the founders didn't limit the nation to people like themselves, for they were unselfish in spirit and very wise. They believed they were creating something new on earth, a generous nation that would find strength in diversity, a nation that would take peoples from all over the world and allow them to become a new people, an American people, more varied in its roots than any other before it. The founders offered the gift of citizenship, not just to their kinsmen, not just to the strong or the handsome or the rich, but full and equally to all those who came here to live. The nation grew, and its citizens understood what was intended. Under the Statue of Liberty, they carved the words, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." Men, women, and children from all over the world came to the Promised Land. Many were refugees, people fleeing tyranny and persecution. Of course, the children Hitler was threatening with death would be welcome in America, or would they? There was another tradition here. It was not the tradition of Jefferson, Washington, and Madison. It was the spirit of greed and selfishness. It was that selfish spirit that had caused the Alien and Sedition Acts to be passed soon after the nation was founded. It was that spirit that had caused men to rise in Congress and say that slavery was a positive good. It was that spirit behind the Know Nothing Party and the Nativist. It was the spirit of the Ku Klux Klan and the only one race allowed country club. It was mean spirited. It was anti American, but it was there. Here's what Abraham Lincoln wrote in 1855. As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. Now we practically read it that all men are created equal except Negroes. When the Know Nothings get control, it will read all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I shall prefer immigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. The imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan in 1923 said, "Negroes, Catholics, and Jews are the undesirable elements in America." The imperial wizard was a bigot, but some people listened to him. They didn't know their history. Maybe they hadn't read the famous letter George Washington wrote the Jews of Newport, Rhode Island. In it, he said, "The government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance." In 1924, Congress passed a racist immigration bill. It was aimed to keep Asians, Jews, blacks, and people who can't speak English out of America. Anti-Semitism and xenophobia, anti-foreignism, had infected some Americans. Some of the people with the disease were in Congress, the State Department, and other government offices. Didn't they realize they were being anti-un-American? Most Americans are hospitable. 85 newspapers wrote editorials urging Congress to pass a bill letting in those 20,000 children for Germany. Citizens offered their homes to the young refugees. Leaders of church, labor, and social organizations spoke out, but not loudly enough. The head of a powerful group, the American Coalition of Patriotic Societies, told Congress to protect the youth of America from this foreign invasion. He shouted this message of the racist. There was a fear in the world and a depression, and Congress listened. Isn't anti-Semitism a Jewish problem? No, it's a human problem. People who hate become hateful. A nation that allows bigotry and persecution is diminished by it. In 1939, the United States government gave sanction to bigotry and assistance to persecution. Those children were not allowed in the United States. Hitler now knew that no one would rescue those children. He felt free to build death camps. 20,000 children and a little girl named Anne Frank ended their lives.